welcome everyone. It's really good to see you, and I hope that you had a good Christmas and a good New Year. And for those in Copenhagen, I hope you survived the lockdown. Yeah, it's really great to be starting having events again in Hub AI. And today we have Léonard, who is a PhD in theory and philosophy of law and artificial intelligence from the Faculty of Law of the University of Copenhagen. And Léonard has finished his PhD, and now he's working as an industrial postdoc researcher at the Danish-Swedish tech law firm called Sync, and he's doing that in collaboration with the Research Center for Private Governance at the University of Copenhagen. Léonard's specialty is finding the legal value of AI ethics. Is that correct, Léonard?
Yeah, you get it right.
Yeah, and it's a really exciting but also complicated area of law. So I think that Léonard will be the best one to tell us what it is about. But before I give the word to Léonard, I'll just mention that Léonard participated in an episode of a podcast, which is really good if you are interested in this area of law and AI. Personally, I listened to it 2 or 3 times when I was writing my exam paper. It was really good. So if you need inspiration for an exam paper, it's really good. But also, if you're just interested in the area, I can really highly recommend you to listen to it. It's one of the best podcast episodes I've listened to. And I will put a link to the podcast in the chat here. Yeah, but I can really recommend you to listen to it. And now I will give the word to Léonard.
Yeah.
If you're ready.
Yes, absolutely. I would like to share my screen, but the host disabled participant screen sharing.
I've now changed the settings. You are now able to share. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem.
Okay. I'll just interrupt you for the last time. So the podcast episode, the title is in Danish, but the podcast is in English. Just so don't be scared about the title.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Monica, for introducing me, and thank you, Letitia, for organizing this event today. I haven't had the opportunity to talk about some aspects of my research for a little while now, and it's been itching me because most of the talks I do these days are to practicing lawyers and industry and engineers and very busy people who are very busy making a lot of money, and they don't always enjoy spending more than 5 minutes listening to the ramblings of an academic. So hopefully today I have a little bit more time to express the full scope of my thoughts on the topic, and that's always a nice opportunity. So thank you for allowing me to do that today. So what I would like to talk about today, I want to talk about my current research project, which is the one I am doing with my law firm, where essentially we're trying to create the knowledge needed to advise businesses on development of AI in the current regulatory setting. Because the problem is that there is no regulation, there is no specific regulation about AI except for a few tidbits here and there, like automatic processing of data, for instance, that touches upon it in the Gdpr. But we don't really have specific regulation. So if ever there is a problem with the technology, or businesses are confronted with a question mark, are we allowed to do this? They don't know who to ask, they don't know what to ask, and they certainly don't have an answer anyway. So this is what I'm trying to do for them, trying to give them answers they can use right now while we wait for regulatory answers by the governments and other international organizations. So the things I want to talk about today, explanation of what are legal issues we're dealing with. What is legally problematic with artificial intelligence? And I was told that most of you aren't lawyers, right? Okay, so I'll try to check myself, not to go too much into complicated language, but if it starts being a little bit too legally, please stop me, and I'll try to vulgarize my language a bit more. But so yeah, I'm just going to introduce, what's the problem with AI? Why is it such a big topic in law? What's so new about it from a legal angle? Isn't it just like any other technology before? Cars, planes, the electricity, the internet? No, it's not. It's not just a question. It's not necessarily just a question of fixing the tiny mismatches between the law and the new state of society. It goes a little bit deeper than that. And that's the problem with AI, is that it disrupts our legal system at a much wider level than previous technologies have, and I'll expand a bit on that. And also explain some of the more specific legal issues that are generated. Then I want to talk about one of my latest papers, the legal concerns of roboticists. So I interviewed a bunch of CEOs, of chief executive officers, and chief technical officers in Odense in Denmark. There's a big robotics hub. They build cobots, so collaborative robots that are meant to work in factory settings together with other professionals. And I just interviewed them to, get their thoughts on the problem. What do they see as challenging? What do they see as problematic? What do they think they can do with the current law, and so on? And that's helpful because it helps build answers to their problems and the problems faced in the industry. Then I'm going to start talking about the different angles of attack we can take on those problems. How can we solve those legal issues, those regulatory problems? And there's essentially two angles. You can either have public governance, so that's your typical legislative body and government decrees, or international organization, treaties, EU regulation, and so on. Or you have private governance, where it's private actors that create the norms, whether it's the companies themselves that self-regulate, that do corporate social responsibility, as they like to call it, a very fancy name, just to say, just to of the companies. And also what you call standardization bodies. So that's organizations like the Institute of Electronics, Electrical, and Electro something engineers in the US, IEEE, easier, or ISO. Maybe some of you have seen that word before, ISO. And that stands for the International Standardization Organization, and they create standards. So they're actually a private entity. They're not international organization constituted by states, member states. They're a private kind of company that creates industrial standards. And so that's prior regulation. It's another way to deal with some of those issues. And then I'm going to look at the angle that I've been looking at with my law firm is like, what legal value can we find in pursuing specific aspect of ethics, which is artificial intelligence ethics, and how can businesses use that in order to secure the future of their companies, to build new technologies, and so on and so forth. So if you see me looking down, it's because I'm looking at my phone. There's my notes on it. I couldn't print my speaking notes today, unfortunately. But yeah, let's start with legal disruption. So I think that the main problem with artificial intelligence and intelligent robotics is that we're developing machines that make decisions. And they make decisions in a way that is way more humane than previous technologies ever have. So that, you know, at the theoretical and philosophical angle, that's all my PhD research is essentially what makes AI complicated from a legal angle is that we create machines with behavior. We create machines that have a discretionary ability to make decisions. When you have discretion, that means you have the right, the freedom to choose between different valid options in law. So, for example, the president in France has the discretionary ability to fire the whole the lower chamber of the parliament. He can use that right, or he can choose not to. It's discretionary. But he can't suddenly decide to fire the whole Senate. That's out of his discretion. That's out of his margin of appreciation. He doesn't have the power to do that. And so a good way to describe how machines make decisions is that they have a certain level of discretion. We give them missions and we parameter the way they're supposed to fulfill those missions. But then once you set them on the mission, they're free to choose between the different options available in order to fulfill that mission. That's essentially the big theoretical problem behind artificial intelligence, and specifically machine learning algorithms that allow systems to make decisions. Is that you? But that's what that's what we want with robots, right? We develop AI because we want machines to make decisions for us, so that we can concentrate on other things that are more valuable or more enjoyable or whatever. So we want robots to make decisions, and we don't want to have to tell them exactly how they're supposed to make those decisions. We don't want to code everything by hand, because that's what we've been doing for a while now. It's called knowledge engineering. It's when essentially you engineer knowledge inside a program so that when it's faced with specific scenarios, it has predetermined decisions it can make. But with the newer brands of AI, what's been interesting with all what you call machine learning is that we don't have to do that anymore. We can just let the machine learn on its own. So you give them a mission, and they learn how to fulfill that mission, and you can validate when you're happy with the way they do it. You know, if you think they've learned, the machine has learned well enough, you say it's good enough, it's safe, it does what it's functional, it does what it's asked to. You can just throw it on the market, and then people will buy it and use it and give a specific mission to the robot, which it will fulfill discretionarily, because it has learned by itself how to do that. So just to specify a little bit this question of discretion. This is how we build a machine learning algorithm. So when the producers of the system, they essentially write or use an algorithm that has the capacity to learn when exposed to data. So you set that algorithm with a specific mission to learn how to achieve X. For instance, I'm going to be very, very broad and very generalistic when I say drive location to location X. In reality, when you're trying to train to build an autonomous vehicle, it's algorithms like that will be given the mission: identify the pavement, identify the stop signs, identify pedestrians, and so on and so forth. But just to simplify things, let's just say that we have an algorithm and we give it the mission: learn how to drive to location X. And then you feed it with data that represents how people have been fulfilling that mission until now. So you feed it, millions of hours of videos of people driving around from a point A to a point B, and essentially the system learns by itself. So what happens there is that we have control over the algorithm at the beginning when we determine how it learns and what the objective of learning should be, the mission, and then we lose control. On a function where, based on its mission and the data, it will find by itself an answer to the mission it's been given. So it learns by itself. But over the course of that learning, we lose control. We regain control when the learning stops and we test the system. We verify how well it has learned, if it fulfills our expectations. If you put it on the street, does it actually take you there? Does it create any accident? So once the learning is done, we regain control. Okay, but the thing is that we don't control everything the system learns, and we can't check everything the system learns. So amidst all this those great driving skills it learns, maybe it learns something we did not want it to learn. The problem is that we don't know that. It's impossible to identify that specifics, every specific aspect of what the system learns, and that's related to what you may have heard as the black box problem. And then you sell the product because you're happy with it, and people buy it, and so you have your autonomous car. And then again, you give it a mission: drive me to location X. You have control, but then the car starts driving and you lose control. All the while the robot is driving around, it's making decisions, it's achieving the mission you've given it. You can retake control from it, if you think it's not doing well, if it's not taking the right path, or if it's about to run into someone. But until you do, or until the robot fulfills its mission, you do not have control over it. So that's a big problem for law, because until now, there was always a human that was directly or indirectly in control over the behavior of the machine, right? Even if you had automatic systems like landmines, for instance, there's still direct human control over them, because you set them in a specific point to react to one specific cue, pressure, and then it does so, but it doesn't have the discretion to choose not to explode. But the robot does. It has the discretion to choose a certain path or another, to label certain images as pedestrians or as cars, and so on and so forth. So we lose control over them, and that's what we want. We want that, right? But for law, it's a theoretical problem here, and that's also a problem for engineers, because who's responsible in the end? Who has the most control? I just said we lose control over them, but if we had to, just indulge me for a second. Who has the most control over the car while it's driving you to location X? Is it you while you're on your phone browsing Facebook because the car is driving around, right? It's doing what it's supposed to. Is it the user that has control over the car at this point? It has the capacity to retake control, but they don't really have control over the car while it's driving around. Who's more responsible for how the machine actually behaves once it's set on a mission in the real world? Well, from a purely causal perspective, it's the producers. It's the producers that give the machine its ability to learn, test that it has learned the right way, and then accept the risks and safety risks that it creates and put it on the market. So they're actually the ones that are responsible. But from a legal perspective, right now, if there was an accident caused by an autonomous vehicle, of course it's impossible because they're not allowed on the streets, blah blah blah. But indulge me in the science fiction that there was a completely autonomous vehicle driving around. It's the user that would be responsible for the accidents caused by the car, because they're the ones that are supposed to be able to retake control over the car. But that's a very different operation from maintaining control in the first place. So that's so the user would be easily responsible from a legal angle for the actions of the autonomous vehicle, except it's not fair because they don't actually have control. So can we make the producers responsible for that? Then there's another problem there. It's called enforceability. The thing is that the technology is becoming less transparent. As I explained, we want that. It's becoming more complex and more tightly coupled. So those terms come from a risk theory. They basically mean that there's more and more factors that interplay in the functioning of the thing, which by itself increases risks. And every element of the system, of the network in the system, are more reliant on one another than in previous technology. They're more tightly coupled. And so that creates grounds for unforeseeability. And what I mean by that is that it becomes harder to predict all the ways an autonomous vehicle or any other robotics can fail for producers. It becomes a much more challenging operation just because they can do so much more, because they evolve in dynamic environments, and because they have this capacity for discretion, for learning by themselves. So all those factors mean that probably in the future, most accidents caused by robots will actually be unpredictable, unforeseeable. And that's a problem for law, because if something is unforeseeable, unpredictable, then that means you can't be responsible for not having designed against that specific safety failure. And that's how our legal systems assess responsibility for product defects in robots or other products. They basically, they ask the producer, so your product failed and injured those people. Was the safety failure predictable? If it was predictable, then you should have done something against it. If it wasn't predictable, well, you're not responsible, right? So that's a problem, because that means the only people that would be responsible would be the users, who are technically the people who don't have control over how the system is behaving. So that's the big legal issue from my angle, or at least one of them. And I think I need to speed up a bit. But yeah, basically that's the problem of unforeseeability. Failures, so robots will be safer, but when they will fail more often for unforeseeable reasons. And if users become responsible for those, that is going to breed distrust in the technology in society. That's the societal problem with what's happening. So let's look at how roboticists tackle those issues, right? How do they think? Are they aware of those problems? Are they doing something about it? They're not. They're not, unfortunately. Firstly, because that's not a real tangible problem for them yet. The robots we develop nowadays are still fenced inside factory settings with strong safety standards for the employees. So sure, it's a more dynamic environment than a completely fenced factory where you basically have barriers, physical barriers around the robots. And as soon as you open the door to penetrate where the robots are, every single robot stops functioning. So that's how, all those robots in those car factories function. They're isolated, physically isolated from human beings, so that even if they fail, there's nobody around. And if there's somebody around there, then the robots can't function in the first place because there's basically a switch. So that's not yet a problem, but the thing is that all the roboticists I talk to, they all say they want to develop AI, they want to build AI into their products, they want to create products that are broader and more usable everywhere in society. So they're going to be faced with that issue eventually. And it was very hard interviewing them, getting them to even just admit the theoretical possibility of unforeseeability. They were like, no, 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 it's impossible. Maybe the robot fails, but I've put all those redundant safety mechanisms, so those overlaid safety mechanisms that will prevent any failure from actually creating a safety failure, creating an accident and getting someone hurt, because I'm such a brilliant engineer and my engineering is flawless. So that's, you know, when they talk like this, it's obviously a bit of a sales pitch that they were doing to me, even though it was very clear I was there as a researcher and they weren't going to sell anything to me, and that they were going to be, you know, anonymized. But it was very hard for them to acknowledge just the fact that actually we are building a technology that has what you call emergent behavior. That means that robots succeed the missions we give them in ways that are emergent, that we will not have thought of, that are going to be unpredictable. But they also fail emergently or unpredictably. And it's very hard to get them to accept that. So how do roboticists think the law, though, more generally, beyond that problem of enforceability? Well, I was surprised to see that they don't think about the law, they only think about safety. For them, law is basically a subset of safety. When you talk about, you know, respecting the the European regulation and directives on machinery, on electromagnetic components and so on and so forth, they don't see this as law, they only see this as safety. So for them, it's a safety issue, not a legal one. For them, legal is only drafting contracts. And the thing is that for them, the way that they function, safety is their last concern. Safety is their last concern. The things they're most concerned about is the economy of their project. Are they going to be able to sell this? The functionality of the product, how good is it going to be at fulfilling the mission we want it to? And then lastly, once those two bugs have been checked, it's the safety, which makes sense because no one wants a safe robot if it's too expensive or doesn't fulfill the mission we want it to fulfill. So from a commercial angle, it makes sense, but still, it shows that that's the last of their concern. They also fail to, they still don't see that they're actually engineering, designing machine behavior. And they still don't see yet that they're not just creating compliant, lawful design, but they also have to design lawful behavior. It's not just about making a car that respects all the specific requirements made by a European driver safety law or whatever. It's also about engineering machines that have the capacity to make decisions that are lawful. Do you understand the difference there? We can come back on that later if necessary. So they don't see yet the societal change in what they're doing. They're not just creating objects anymore. They're creating decision-making abilities. They're creating behavior a little bit in machines. And that's a more sensitive societal and legal action than just building a machine. Another thing I observe is that they tend to push back responsibility to people down the line. Like most robots producers essentially say, you know, they sell robot parts. As I said, you know, the MIR or the universal robot platforms I mentioned earlier, they're not finished. They're built to be modified. And they say, as soon as you modify it, we can't guarantee that it's safe anymore. So we're not responsible for any damages it creates, because if you put a balloon at the end of my robot arm, and if you put a knife, it's not the same safety concerns. It's fair. It's fair enough, but they refuse to recognize any kind of responsibility as soon as the product is modified, which is also problematic. They're actually scared of AI. roboticists, funnily enough. As much as they're very boisterous about saying their products are safe, they're also scared of this technology. So interesting contradictions there also. But let's move on. So how do we save those? How do we fix those problems? How do we fix those different issues I mentioned with the enforceability, the discretionary decision making, the loss of control, but most importantly, the enforceability. That's the biggest first problem. If we find a good solution to this one, we effectively foster the development of robotics in society and in the rest of the world. So it's arguably the first and most important step. So how does it function, regulation in those kind of cases? If you look at previous disruptive technologies, like, for instance, let's look at the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, or let's look at the deployment of cars throughout society in the early 1900s. Or even at a question of electricity or nuclear power. Industrial Revolution created, for those of you who have studied law or looked a bit at history, it's massive societal changes. You had to deal with questions of urbanization and change in growth and so on. From a purely legal angle, the big questions with Industrial Revolution was responsibility of the employer for damages caused to the employees. Because essentially the building of machinery, of steam machinery and coal machinery, that created much more injuries. People at work would get injured much more. And employers would just say, I'm not responsible. I'm not piloting that machine. So I'm not responsible for that guy's lost hand. And obviously that was a big problem because, they were out of a job and they probably would not find a job afterwards. So that's a big remodeling of corporate responsibility, of legal personhood for companies, of also of work law, labor law, sorry, and so on. So this one technology kind of creates a very, very tall legal issue, right? And it's, it wasn't that wide, the legal issues created by the Industrial Revolution, because it didn't affect marriage law, it didn't affect warfare. Well, yes, but not directly. It didn't, it only really affected corporate law and labor law. Essentially, that's the two things that really affected, but it was actually a very, very high problem. And legislators are good at dealing with those very, very high problems, because they can just work on the specificities of everything and deal with the issues and offer a good, strong answer. Another example is deployment of electricity, for instance. So now electricity isn't such a big, as tall a wide problem, as tall a legal problem. Much more, it was wide, because you had the deployment of electricity all throughout the country, through all sorts of industries, the functioning and the home, and access to electricity became as a basic commodity and so on. So it kind of created many tiny legal issues everywhere, right? But that was a very, very wide legal problem, but it wasn't very high. The difficulty of dealing with electricity wasn't great. So it was easy for parliaments to create very generic, very broad legal regimes that dealt with those issues without a problem. So how does that compare to artificial intelligence? So artificial intelligence is like electricity in the sense that it's everywhere. I can foresee the use of AI in every field of human activity, but it's also extremely tall, like the Industrial Revolution, because as I mentioned, the kind of legal problems that AI creates are very tall, they're very complex, they're very minute, and require many adjustments and sometimes very big theoretical changes in our legal regimes. So it's not just a wide problem; it's also a very sporadically tall. It's not so much that I don't think it's like a big pallet that's very high. It's more like there's a base pallet with many spires and towers protruding up everywhere. In terms of that kind of analogy, I was building in height and width of legal issues. So to solve AI legal issues is going to take a lot of precision, of work, of understanding, of fine-tuning. But the problem is that those problems are going to be observable everywhere in almost every field of legal practice. And that becomes a problem because legislators have limited time and resources. So what can we do to deal with those issues? The first option would be for legislators to do an electricity style legal adaptation. So very broad answer that answers kind of everything, but it will lack the precision necessary to deal with all those minute, tiny, tall problems everywhere. And the other option for them is to deal with those very tall issues one by one, leaving all the rest unanswered, which is also problematic. So what I would recommend governments do is that they should create broad legal regimes, very broad legal regime that empowers private governance to fix the leftover problems in a way that fosters trust in the technology. And so this is what I'm going to start looking at right now. But essentially, get the standardization organizations to work on the minute legal problems by giving a stronger legal value to good faith, to due diligence, to good practices in the industry. If you make it a stronger requirement to use ethics in building your systems, then the producers will naturally get together and create more specific answers to the legal problems they are facing. But they need the push to do so, and they need the carrot and also the stick. So how would that work? So my ideas are based largely on the European Union's high-level expert group on AI, on trustworthy, how is it called? Guidelines for Trustworthy Artificial Intelligence, where essentially they're developing all those ethical standards that should become regulation according to them. That should be an inspiration for regulation in the future. So I've looked at those and I look, okay, so that's not going to come in the next 5 years. So what can we do now in order to get businesses to gain some level of clarity, of legal protection, in a way that fosters trust in the technology, that prevents that user backlash I hinted to in the beginning? Well, I think that you just give legal value to good faith, due diligence. Those are already existing legal concepts. Good faith means that when you sign a contract, when you bind yourself to do X, Y, and Z, you are supposed to fulfill your obligations in a way that stays aligned with the spirit of the contract you signed. So, for instance, if you sign this contract and bind yourself to build a fence around your house because whatever you're doing in your garden is bothering your neighbors, if you build your fence in a way that makes your neighbors super pissed because it destroys their view over whatever the sky or something, or is very noisy or attracts insane amount of birds, and you do that on purpose, you're not fulfilling your obligations in good faith. And diligence is when you're diligently trying to respect the law. So that's not in contracts, that's more broadly. You should be diligent in the way you maintain your home. For instance, if you have a dog, you have to exercise due diligence in the sense that your dog does not have the possibility to go in your neighbor's garden and thrash everything. You're supposed to be diligent over your possessions, over what you do, in order for them to be safe for people around you and not cause damage. But if we give those two concepts a stronger legal value when it comes to AI, like for instance, if your product causes a damage, causes an accident, your autonomous vehicle while performing its mission for its user, if the accident was unforeseeable, you should still be responsible based on how diligent and how much good faith you put into building good design. So typically, all those producers that create those MIR, UR robots that are meant to be modified but refuse any responsibility for modifications, they're not in good faith. They're not in good faith. So that's just a short example. So to be more specific, for those of you who are familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation, there's requirements in the GDPR for transparency and explainability in case of automatic decision making. So if you use a service, a bank, and they have automated loan assessment, they should be able to explain to you how your loan was rejected by the machine. And so right now, the way they do this is very lame. They just sit a bank teller in front of you that says, well, that's what the machine says, and we use the machine, and that's how we explain it. And that's not amazing. Sorry, let me start over that bit. The problem with this explainability and transparency of automatic decision making is that if you have a black box system that makes decisions, you can't explain it. You can't, there is no transparency. That's how the machines function. So what I'm suggesting is that we build a glass box, an ethics glass box around the black box. So by showing that you are fulfilling as many ethical principles as possible in the building of your system, you can use that as a proxy explanation for how your system came up with how it decided. Even though you're not actually explaining how the machine made the decision, you can confidently explain that your design was ethical and diligent and in good faith, and that's good enough to explain it. Another method that we've been developing with my law firm is what we call the legal risk assessment method, where we essentially gave a lawyer's perspective on engineering and design from that angle of AI and foreseeability and risks, because they tend to, as I mentioned, to keep safety in the last, right? That's the last concern. But we built a method where they can actually increase the safety of their product without necessarily affecting the economy of their product. And we essentially we took our lawyer's eye on, if you were in front of a court, in front of a judge, and your product had failed and it was unforeseeable, and what kind of arguments would convince the judge that you're responsible or not. And based on this, we created a number of criteria that we recommend to engineers look at those criteria and try to self-assess your product while you're building it, facing those criteria, and you document that process of risk analysis, and you try to enforce a certain number of ethical principles. And by doing so, you hopefully build a better defense, a better legal defense should the need come. So the way they should do it is that they should have those kind of reiterative, documented analysis of their products based on different factors of risk that I will list. It should be done regularly at different stages of the development, of the marketing, of the sales, and after of the product. And also it should be done by people from different professional and educational backgrounds, not just engineers, because they have a very good ability to acquire good enough skills to do any task, but sometimes they fail the more minute sense of things and get lost a bit in that, thinking that they can do it, but they can't necessarily do everything on their own. So how does it function? I tell roboticists to ask themselves a bunch of questions like, how salient is your product? So that's like, very stupid question, but what kind of environment is your robot going to evolve in? Is it a submarine robot? That's not very salient. There's not a lot of human beings or human constructs on the seabed. So that's not, your product creates less risks if it's in an environment where there's not many human vulnerabilities than if you're deploying a robot in a childcare institution.
I think we have a question here.
Yes.
If it's okay. How do you relate the principle of glass box to the principle of explainable AI, which is being thrown around a lot in data science circles?
So that concept of glass box comes from a paper written by Virginia Dignam, who's the head of the WASP-HS research program in how is it called? UMEA. I hope I'm not mispronouncing it too painfully to you. But she suggests that we can explain black box by building an ethics glass box around it. So that's a conversation that actually comes from the field that you're quoting. I'm just looking, okay, so what legal value does it have? What kind of legal value can we find to that glass box? That's the question I've been asking, but it definitely comes from that field. So it's definitely equated to it. I'm just trying to explain how this kind of arguments would function in regards to a judge. If your company is being assessed for its GDPR compliance, or public administrations that assess your GDPR compliance, how would that work in front of those people? What kind of legal arguments could you build based on those? Other criteria, coming back to my legal risk assessment method, is like relation to decision making. If a robot is actively making decisions, it's more risky than if the robot is merely recommending or aiding decision. Is it replacing or enhancing human performance? Is it taking the place of a human performing an action we've been performing for a very long time? Or is it performing something completely new that was not able before the technology? When you replace human performance, that's less risky because we have experience doing that. We've done it in the past. We know how it functions. So we've probably spotted a number of things that can go wrong. But if it's something that we could never do before, there's a knowledge gap. And the time for us to fill that knowledge gap, that means there will be more risks. And there's other questions of integrity and integration and continuity of human control. Is it, when you're driving your autonomous car around, do you merely have the legal obligation to retake control if ever things go wrong? Like it's just written on a piece of paper, you should keep your attention on the road at all times in order to be able to retake control from the car? Or does the car automatically park itself as soon as as soon as you don't answer visual cues on the board that's asking for you to retake control for a little while to show that you're paying attention? Because in the first case, there is no real control. It's not integrated in the machine. In the second one, if you have design that actually nudges control, it's much safer. What else? And then there's like more technological factors. How I don't have the pretension to tell engineers how to build their systems. What I'm looking at is, if you were going to argue this in front of a judge, how would they think? How would they look at your product and say that your product is defective? You're the responsible for that or not? So now I've done my disclaimer, and of course I do disclaimers all the time because I'm a lawyer after all. If the product has many different internal components that all interact together and influence one another, and the machine actually functioning depends on many different softwares and pieces of hardware and motors and so on, it's much more risky than if it's a robot with two components, because there's less, it's more complex, it's more tightly coupled in the first case than it is in the second, coming back to what I talked about earlier. And then at an external level, is your device dependent on external technologies? Is it integrated in an Internet of Things? Does it depend on GPS to function? Does it depend on, does it interact with other autonomous cars around it in order to know how to function? Because if it does, then again, it's a more complex network. If something fails in the network, then potentially there's a failure in your product. So that's more risky. And so on and so forth. So my hope is that they kind of look at those criterias and do the hard work of trying to integrate AI ethics, explainability, transparency, safety, and so on, and document their things and explain how they thought about all those risks and how they decided to deal with those, how much effort they put into training their users rather than just telling them these are your obligations, and so on and so forth. So that's been my hope with this aspect of the project, and we're starting to get good results with this, with the roboticists we work with. And so hopefully it helps a bit develop and deploy robots faster in society, which is my personal objective. So that was all. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion we're about to start.
Did anyone have questions? Because I have tons. So.
Well, I just wanted to say that it's a very interesting topic we're discussing today. I mean, from a law student point of view, but also like from other disciplines. I think this is an important topic to discuss as well. And I just had I wanted to share that I just had a patent law course, and there we look at the patentability of AI, and we were talking about, one of the things that we talked about was the AI generated invention, and there we discuss about, one of the formal requirements is for the inventor to be human. But what happens when we're talking about the machine inventor? So there was a recent case now, which is called Dabu's case, and there more than just like trying to analyze whether AI machines can be considered an inventor, it goes back to, like we discussed earlier, like the liability, because human inventors have rights and obligations. That's why we need human inventors. So that's why I think it's very interesting to see, like in the future, for example, when AI generated inventions become possible to be an inventor as well, what happens to liability and other legal issues that exist now. Yeah.
Thank you for those encouraging remarks. I don't know the first thing about patent law, so I'm not sure I can add much to your already interesting remarks.
Yeah. No. I just wanted to share about it. Like, there's a thought, like, can robots enter into contracts, for example? Is it? I don't know if it's. I'm not very. How would say knowledgeable if that's possible. It's being done today.
So there's been that professor in the US, can't remember his name, but he wrote that thought experiment that today, thanks to American corporate law, you could actually have an AI with no humans behind as the sole actor behind a company.
Yeah.
And essentially, what he was saying is that, a few number of legal maneuvers. If you create a company, then you sell it to another entity, and you do that a couple of times or something like that. Then and the only thing behind the company is actually an AI software that makes specific decisions about something. Then in the end, it's the only thing left in the company. There's no one left in the company except for that robot, and therefore it has legal personhood as a company would. So that's an interesting thought experiment. It's not reality. I don't think it could become reality.
Yeah.
But it was interesting that he got into that exercise. But definitely the question of the ability of signing contracts as for robots would require legal personhood. And there was a very heated debate for a little while on this question, with ludicrous suggestions even coming from the European Parliament to give legal personhood to robots.
Yeah.
And a lot of legal academics getting in the kind of very entertaining debate about whether an AI could have legal personhood.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting exercise intellectually, but I just think it's a big it displaces our attention to things that are not useful or interesting at this stage. I think that there's many good arguments why a robot should not be given legal personhood. It's technically feasible, but in practice, it wouldn't achieve what we're trying to achieve with regulating AI.
Yeah.
That's the easy answer to the thing. So I hope that robots will never be able to get into contracts.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's one question here we had before when you mentioned the concept of legal risk assessment. What other legal disciplines other than GDPR would such an assessment cover, would you say?
Health and safety regulation. That's the big first one. There would be extra contractual responsibility, so torts. Also, but yeah, mainly torts. And I mean, the legal risk assessment is one thing, and the glass box, the GDPR glass box, is another thing. The legal risk assessment is specifically designed for producers of complex robotics and complex AI software operating in sensitive cases and prone to unforeseeable failures. The glass box one is more for companies using AI as a service, including banks or insurance companies or other types of services that make decisions that have an impact on people. I guess that they could also use the legal assessment to build their ethics profiles. But yeah, I think that's all that comes to mind for what other fields would be relevant to that topic.
Okay.
If I just thought this idea of like a legal legal risk assessment method really reminded me of aviation, and I think in your history analogy you should maybe also add aviation. I mean, this is just your electricity and industrial was great, but if you look at aviation, not many people, because there were so many accidents, loads of people were like, hell no, I am never flying again. And so what they did was like the aviation.
If they had an aviation accident, I don't think they had the pleasure of actually saying that, but your point remains valid.
I reckon whilst they were in the air, like, oh God, no. I'm already in heaven. We're fine. I get it. But yeah, but now they have they have an agreement, an international agreement, where they report every accident, and it's very transparent. You know, everyone has a duty to do so. And I mean, now, like, I personally, okay, when there's a turbulence, I'm a little bit scared, but like, I'm okay with being on a plane.
Yeah.
So I wonder if like the legal risk assessment method could also lead to, do you think that it could like lead to something like that for robots, where that leads to more trust? Or is that?
I hope, because I think that your example is very good in the sense that we managed building trust in the technology of aviation, partly thanks to those initiatives. So it's good inspiration for also for robotics and AI in general. And I hope that that's my meager contribution paves the way in a small way towards that. But no, definitely. I mean, aviation is a very, very good example. Thanks for sharing that with me, because definitely it's true there's been a lot of problems. There still are a number of problems, but they managed making it really, really safe. But then the demand was very high, right? Just the possibility of flying has been very appealing through human history. So it was easy to convince the economic actors, you have to make planes really, really, really safe, and you have to be really, really transparent about it. Because people were really interested in flying, in using safe flight. I think maybe the difference with AI is that people don't necessarily see a value in AI by itself as we would in flying. So the reaction might just be, forget it. Stop bothering me with your AI. It's not safe. It's not this. I don't want it. Get rid of robots. They're taking our jobs. Make human workers great again. That's easily foreseeable. That kind of reaction. You know, when electricity, was it when electricity or trains were being built everywhere? You had this Luddite movement in the UK, which was basically a mob movement against the technology, and they were trashing places and building support against technology, and they would publish propaganda in the streets with pictures of like electric wires shaped into an electric post shaped into big spiders, controlling your mind in the distance. And to a certain extent, that's what you're seeing nowadays with COVID, right? With vaccines, and completists are saying that we're putting chips into people. So, you know, it could easily become that with AI, I think. And people will just, in this case, people will just be like, no, forget it. Just move on to the next thing. Maybe flight was easier to convince people to give it another try. We'll make it right.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll have a second chance with AI.
Yeah, that's
not for a long time, at least.
Yeah. So no Washington Agreement coming up. That's what it's called. Yeah.
The aviation agreement.
Yeah, is it called? I don't know. I think it was drawn up in Washington. I don't really, but in case I seem like I came up with this myself, I did not. I look at AI in healthcare, and every time they're like, if aviation did it, so can AI in healthcare. But they never explain why. But it's clearly because of the agreements. But yeah, did anyone have any questions? Otherwise, I have more. Usually, because sometimes it's nice to have a different perspective, because Marika and I both have legal backgrounds. So I just thought, if I picked on someone like Melika, who has a psychology background, what do you make out of like robots, artificial intelligence, like all about like how engineers see their role? Like they don't think that maybe the law is that interesting to them. Like from a psychology perspective, what do you make it of all of it?
Yes, of course it is. And several times at our events, I actually mentioned how I personally believe, and it's well spoken among psychologists circle, how we think that our expertise could be important in these legal issues. And I am really not familiar with the fact how it is going on in Sweden or even more internationally. So I kind of need information on that. When you are getting entangled with robotics, like do you ever consult psychologists? That would be my the most basic question I can give you. But yeah, I really appreciate that you actually mentioned yourself that it should be more of a interdisciplinary approach, and not just engineers getting entangled with these things. So yeah, let's start from there.
Could you develop a little bit about that question? How would you see the because I'm not that familiar, unfortunately, with that field. So how would you see psychology being helpful for roboticists?
For roboticists, okay. So let's say it this way. From the very basis, from the very beginning of developing automation systems and artificial intelligence, the idea behind it kind of has its roots in human cognition. So going from that side, the inspiration comes from things we are working on as psychologists, exploring humans' mind. And now the inspiration came from humans' mind, and it is going to these automation systems and artificial intelligence, trying to recreate what is human mind doing. My question would be, during those processes of engineering, has it ever happened to you to hear that someone consulted a psychologist, as I said previously? And why do I think that it could be important? Is because these systems could become so complex and so hard to comprehend for a normal, healthy human brain, speaking from evolutionary perspective. So where is the limit when it gets too complicated to control from human side? Is there the end to healthy automation level? Like what is the limit? I don't know if you can understand this question a bit better now.
Yeah, definitely. And while you were speaking, I had a few ideas about how psychology at least informs lawyers on those questions. There's one first concept that's called automation bias.
Yes.
That's very important and very useful for my work, at least. And it's one of the reasons why I talk about, when I was talking about this question of integration and continuity of control, legal risk assessment factor, that's based on automation bias. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept, automation bias is the idea that the more you interact with an automated system, and the more it delivers on the missions you give it, that it performs well, the more you're biased to think it will do the right thing. So the day it fails, you fail to retake control from the autonomous vehicle, because you've been exposed so much in the past to the fact that it actually did the right thing. And that's exactly why that poor lady died in Arizona, in the US, a few years ago with the Uber accident, because she saw the warning signs. So she was on her phone, but she saw the warning signs, and she thought that the car was just going to retake control, but it never did. So that's one thing. Another thing where psychology has informed work on law and AI, it's on research on violence against robots. So there's some researchers that have been suggesting that violence against robots should be forbidden. It should be forbidden to beat up, attack, hit robots in any way. Not because we value robots, not because we are giving them a human right of bodily integrity, but just because research has shown that people who get used to attacking and hitting animals have higher chances of being violent against other human beings. So if people have the possibility to be violent against robots, especially robots that look human, that could potentially increase their tendencies for violence against human beings. And that's something we want to avoid. So this, I don't know, I don't think that answers every aspect of your question, but it's just the few things that came to my mind.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we're just discussing, we are trying to come up with some ideas. It's also difficult for me to involve psychology with this field. So there are a few things that are hard to understand from my perspective, but that's why we are here. We are trying to gain new ideas, to get new insights, for colleagues to explain something to me, from me to explain something to my colleagues as well. Yeah, of course. But thank you.
Would you consider it, would it be psychology if we look at the way a robot functions and that influences actions by other human beings? Like all those questions of human-computer interaction, robot,
Yes.
human-robot interaction, is that psychology or is that anthropology and I don't know what?
I am not really familiar with the subjects of anthropology, but from psychological perspective, I can say that it does come to our field. For instance, at my very first course here in Lund, and I'm a master's student, we had a course which was, we spoke a lot about the concept of extended cognition. Like with automation, people aren't really relying on their cognition on their own. They are just seeing this possibility that they can put some activities into other entity outside their bodies, outside their brain. And that is where we can propose the same question. Where is the limit to that? What that does to human ability to cope with 21st century technologies and something that will come after that? Like where is the limit? How much we can take as human beings? And that is also something which I can directly relate to legal systems. When you mentioned in case of, I don't know, a car accident, who should be held responsible? Who can account for whether it was person's fault of the person who was in that car? Like, was the person able to predict what will happen, etc., etc.? Was the person who was constructing that certain car responsible for constructing it the way they did?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely recommend my clients at the law firm, the roboticists, to at least give it some thought. How does your what can a psychologist tell you about the way your designs, your product influences behavior of human beings around you? So that's a very good point. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then we get to bring in, I like I said, I like to pick on people, but it's okay. I do ask for their consent, so just in case. And we turn to Bart, who does his master's in communication. And I don't know if your thesis is still standing and you're going to look at like how you communicate, what AI does and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I was going to say, sorry, I kind of came in like halfway through your lecture because I was in the middle of like 15 Zoom calls today. So hopefully you didn't mention some of the stuff. But I guess so. Like, since I'm part of the media and communication school, I'm really interested in the fact how AI is explained and how it sets expectations of regular humans, specifically laymen who aren't kind of part of the system. And obviously, I think there's a big legal implication or crossover in there. And during your talk, it kind of reminded me a lot of there's this PhD researcher in Germany that's coined the term autono-washing. It's specifically regarding kind of greenwashing the idea of autonomous vehicles and the AI systems in there. Like her research was specifically on a Tesla and Mercedes, how they have their autonomous vehicles, but they have specific legal rule sets, and they tell their users that you can only do it and use it in specific ways. For example, in Tesla cars, you always have to have your hands on a wheel, no matter what. Like it's autonomous to a point. It's not fully autonomous, but there's a disconnect between what the car actually can do and the legal things that they tell you to do, and the way it's marketed and shown off. For example, she showed examples of I'm blanking on the Tesla CEO at the moment.
Elon Musk?
Yeah, Elon Musk. She showed him literally like on TV shows in the US, like showing, hey, look, you can just take your car, you can take your hands off the road and it's fully driving you and things like that, where if you're reading the legal specifications, if a user would actually do that themselves and the car hits somebody, then it's on the user's fault. Yeah. So it's to me, it's kind of interesting to see marketing efforts really pushing the definitions of what AI is to audiences, and potentially putting audiences at risk for legal stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, this question of communication and setting expectations in your user is something that's also very important from my angle in terms of user manuals and disclaimers for in the contracts of sale. If it's a difference, it's like what I was saying with this question of nudging control, right? If you just have a line in your contract that says you should be maintaining control at all times over the vehicle, you're responsible if something happens, that's one thing. But then if the system actually nudges that control at the technological and a design angle, that's another one. And maybe you missed the part of the lecture where I was saying, you know, who's responsible while the car is driving? Is it the person? You know, is it acceptable from a legal angle to equate maintaining control over you know, a classic car to retaking control from the car when it's about to do something wrong? Because that's what those formulations do. When they say you are responsible for maintaining attention on the autonomous car while it's driving, they're essentially saying that maintaining control over the car and retaking control over the car are the exact same operation. At, you know, maybe we can ask, was it Melika that talked just before? Does that sound like it's the same cognitive operation to do those things, to keep focused attention for an extended period of time on something specific, rather than multitasking control while thinking about your dinner or something, looking at the sky and not paying attention to the road because the car is driving? That's not the same, but at a legal angle, they try to make it the same. And I'm saying that's bad faith. That's not true. That's not how it should be. So definitely there. And also, that's also one of the things I would tell my clients is like, look at the way you market your product. What kind of expectations are you setting in your clients with your commercial communication, and how is that going to affect the way they're going to use it? Is that going to increase potentially the risks of your design or not? So that's also a very interesting and important angle. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I try and see if anyone's gonna add anything. But yeah, but I think another thing about what you mentioned about the ethical consideration. Sorry, this is kind of going back because I'm not too familiar with like communication and everything. But I completely agree about like setting people's expectations, like what is it, da da da. But there were a few things that I had some questions about, and the first one was how you mentioned about machine learning and how it learns like what it wants and not what it learns what it wants, but we don't know about it and all of that. And you can kind of bypass the black box situation, like by saying why we didn't loan you something, by actually saying, okay, well, we fulfilled the design was made in consideration with the ethical guidelines, for example, by the high level expert group. But my question, actually, I have two in this. The first one is the ethical consideration themselves, like the guideline themselves say that that you can't, like, one will, like, they're not, there's 7 requirements, but those 7 requirements, they kind of, like, there's no hierarchy, and it's hard to know the hierarchy. It, like, I think the best analogy I can use for that is kind of like, you know, people want to buy clothing that's ethical, but it's impossible for you to buy ethical clothing. You have to give something up. Like, it might be that you want for it to be a certain fabric because it's more fair trade, but you'll find out that it actually needs so much more water. So from that, there's an ethical clash. And that's for clothing. So I'm guessing at an AI level, then there's an even bigger clash. And so can you really just use the disclaimer of the design was ethically, like, suited, or how? Yeah.
Well, the way I see it is that they're not necessarily saying the design was ethically suited, whether for the Ligara method or the glass box, black box thing, is that they actually, it's not just a statement, like, you know, that's what the CE marking is. When you put a machine, a car, or a piece of electronics on a European market, the producer has to CE mark it. So they put that kind of CE sign on it that you probably have all seen. But that's a declaration by the producer. It's not actually, unfortunately, your declaration are just saying we've CE marked it, which from a legal angle means we certify that we have fulfilled all the requirements set by the machinery directive, and we have done so by fulfilling the ISO and IEEE standards number 1, 2, and 3. And this is how we did it. So that demonstrates our product is safe, and therefore we can CE mark it. But there is actually a big process behind that, and that's what we aim at, right? They say, you know, they could say we have ECE marked, ECE ethically ethical certification européenne of the product. And we have all the documentation to prove it. So the day there is a problem in front of the court, they can actually come up with that. Or they can even, you know, make parts of it known to the public. They can publish parts of it on their website and explain this is how our products were designed, this is how we do it, to build trust in their system. That's also something I recommend they do. Voluntarily show some parts of the results of that process to build trust in the technology and in their products. So it wouldn't just be we've done the work. There would have to be some form of proof and reasoning behind them. And then, of course, the judges and the opposing parties would definitely be able to say, well, it's ethical there, but actually it's unethical here. And that's part of the court process, naturally, and of the debate that follows it. But at least they have something to fight with from the beginning. And they're forced to put some thought into it. And that's all. One of the other things I recommend they do, write down try to identify the things you give up. Try to identify the trade-offs you've made in your design, whether it's having a fair trade cloth that takes more water, or a non-fair trade cloth that's very sustainable. But they should definitely think about that. What are the trade-offs? What are we giving up in order to achieve this?
Yeah, which I think is really key, because I think if you just, like, when we think of ethics, we're like, oh, okay, then it's fulfilled and therefore we're doing the right thing. Like, I don't know, if you buy like a like almond butter that's like ecological and yeah, but I don't know. I mean, everyone's free to choose whatever they do. I also eat almond butter, but I just thought I would make the comparison. But my other question was about machine learning and your definition that it learns and it learns on its own. And whilst I agree with that, for me, machine learning still requires a data set. That data set it requires quality. Well, I think so, because if it's not very good data set, then you know. But then how do you verify the quality of a data set? And like, can that enable some sort of control? And like, how do you go, because it's all like data, training data. So how is the whole process of things?
So definitely, that's a very important aspect of the thing, and I forgot to mention that the things that the producer have control over is the type of learning algorithm they use, the kind of mission they give it, and then the data set they feed it. And necessarily, if you give it a bad data, then you get garbage in, garbage out. But sometimes you think you've put in good data, even from a data science perspective, and it turns out you don't control everything that the system learns from that data. And that's part of what happened with other initiatives, for example, in the US, where they fed machine learning systems data set that seemed neutral, that seemed balanced and unbiased, but ended up actually they were biased against certain minorities and so on. So it's very difficult. It's very tricky. And that comes back to the fact that we don't control what the system learned, because you could have the best data in the world, the best curated data, but we can't actually see exactly what the system learns. We can only control that it performs the way we want it to. So to give you an example, so you have machine learning methods called supervised learning, and there's sometimes subtypes of learning where you can actually have a human controller that manually validates when a robot does the right thing. So you see it training, and whenever it does the action you want to reinforce, maybe it's reinforced learning, not supervised learning, reinforcement learning. Then you reinforce that by clicking yes, it was the right thing. By doing it enough time in enough context, then hopefully the system learns to do it fairly well. But the thing is that when you click yes, when you click validate, you validate everything. You don't pinpoint, this is what I validate. You validate the whole situation that made the robot arrive to the conclusion it did. So, when you show a child, you did it right, the drawing is perfect. It understands that what it did good was the drawing, but the robot understands that what it did was the robot was the drawing was good, and the driving around was good, and whatever weird robotic farts it have during that time were also good. So we don't even know what we reinforce precisely.
I think this is a good time to bring in someone who does their PhD in AI and healthcare, or machine learning and healthcare. Rafsan, you can correct me.
Yeah, hi guys. Sorry, I couldn't attend almost like 90% of the lecture. I just came in the last moment because I had to work. But I have a question, and maybe you already answered it. So whenever we are developing autonomous systems, right? Sometimes there are cases where the coder or someone who develops the system doesn't really have a choice. And for example, if you build an autonomous car and there's a situation where the car has to hit two different people on the road, and the car makes a decision, and suppose there's an older person and a kid, and the car hits the old person. And also, for example, if you are suppose designing production systems or autonomous production systems and trying to suppose there's an accident in the production line and it affects one of the workers. So in that case, like from a legal perspective, how does choice for autonomous systems come in?
Sorry, can you repeat the second example, please?
If I have an autonomous system in production line, suppose you're manufacturing, I don't know, canned goods, and there are two workers in the production line, and there's a situation where the autonomous system has to injure one of the workers.
Right. Okay.
And it makes a decision. So how does that come into the picture?
So that's what you call accident optimization. From my angle, and it's questions of ethical dilemmas. You know, which one do you choose to hurt, or do you even choose to hurt any of those at all, or do you just let fate decide for you? So there's actually been some interesting papers written on that topic for autonomous vehicles. For example, producers will have a very strong, autonomous vehicle producers will have a very strong incentive to always choose to save the life of the driver. Because who will want to buy a car that will sacrifice the driver? So that's a bit. Should it be the governments that make that kind of decision for the producers? Should we let them decide, taking the risk that they always decide to save the drivers, and so on? So it's a very complex question. And I don't really know how they would do it technically. I guess feed it data. Like I know that there's this initiative that was built by I think was it MIT that did this ethical dilemma experiment where they just put hundreds of different cases and people online were asked to review them and say who they would decide to kill. And maybe they can feed that. So who decides? It's people on the internet that decide who gets to die. So it's a very yes.
Can I throw in a comment on the question?
Yes.
So I don't remember which lecture it was, but we were talking about automatic cars and the dilemma between should you kill an old lady or a child. And what we're saying at the lecture was that the car follows the rules. So the car will stop for red and it will drive in the right or left side of the lane according to the law. And usually it's not the car that kills people. It's the driver who is drunk or someone crosses the road when there is a red light. So his argument was that we shouldn't focus on the car and which choices the car makes. We should focus on how people are behaving on the road, because often it's because you have like a driver who doesn't pay attention to the road. That's why we have car accidents. So he wants to remove the focus from the car to the people and how we behave on the road, if that makes sense.
For autonomous vehicles.
Excuse me?
For autonomous vehicles.
Yeah.
That we shouldn't
and for
focus
example,
on.
And if you're in a manufactory or you have a machine, should it injure one worker or the other? Well, it should injure the worker who doesn't follow the rules of how handling the machine. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So it's putting that perspective bothers me because again, his
headline was like "People are idiots." That was his headline, and you
is that an argument? Is that an argument from your professor?
It wasn't a professor. But the headline was like, people are idiots. So when you work with a machine and you get your finger cut off, it's because you don't pay attention. It's because you didn't read the manual. It's because you, etc. So
no, I mean, does that mean that? I mean, it makes sense to a certain extent that we should try to increase safety in systems and industry and so on, and people shouldn't cross if it's red. But then there's always going to be some cases where it's no one's fault, you know. That's why we need those accident optimization choices, is because it's theoretically impossible to say that there will always be a person outside the car, or you know, the user of the car, that is responsible for what's happening, because sometimes it's just, you know, no luck, and someone has to get hurt. So it remains a very theoretical exercise to ask this question: who should we kill? Maybe a bit of morbid fascination from
No,
the
I'm just curious, like when an autonomous system does have a choice, and it makes a choice, then who does the implication for that choice fall to? Like, who's responsible for it? It cannot be the developer. Because, the machine is following a set of rules, right? It cannot be the user as well, right?
Well, okay, so that was your question. Sorry, I'm getting a bit tired and I got lost in the details. Yes, definitely not the user. Well, it depends actually. If you want to go more in precision than this, I think that producers are responsible. Let's start it the other way. The user is responsible for setting the machine on a mission, and retaking control when the system is malfunctioning. That's the two obligations that are on the user. The user, that doesn't necessarily apply to people on the street, right? Mm-hmm. Like you mentioned. But just to clarify that, so how do you make sure the person sets the mission right? Well, they have to read the user manual. Maybe they have to get some kind of professional training with the producer in order to know how to handle the system and know exactly when or not to use it. And then they need to maintain a certain degree of vigilance in order to retake control, which, as I explained, is not the same as maintaining control in the first place. So outside of this, if the user has set the machine on a mission within the recommended parameters and within also good due diligence of them, you know, they should also try to think on their own, not just follow the user manual. And if they haven't failed to retake control, or if it was impossible for them to retake control, then everything goes back to the producer, I think. That doesn't necessarily mean the producer has to be responsible in the end for the actual payment of the damages, but they have more control over what the machine does while it's executing its mission than the people who actually set the machine on its mission. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's still kind of like a gray area right now.
Yeah, it's still a gray area, but I would tend to think that, so scenario one, the user did not set the machine on a mission, or failed to retake control, didn't set the mission on the mission right, didn't set the machine on the mission right, or failed to retake control when it was possible, the user is responsible. Then second case, the user did comply with those, but still there was a failure that led to damages. Then we look at the producer, and there's two possibilities. Either the safety failure was predictable, and then the producer should have done something about it, either design, mitigate, or warn against the potential failure. And if they didn't do this, then they should be responsible. And the other one is when the accident was unpredictable, was unforeseeable. And in those cases, there's two subcases. The first one is they were in good faith. They really tried their best. They've done the legal risk assessment. They've went deep into it. They really tried to go beyond the industrial standards, beyond the state of the art. They really put their hearts into their design and making something safe. And the other scenario is they didn't do that, or they just tried to do as cheap and a functional project as possible, and just met the bare minimum obligations they had to in order to sell the product. In that case, they should be responsible for the damages caused by the machine. But on the other hand, if they did do all the hard work of being in good faith and so on, then they should be responsible for a small part of the damages, not all of it. But then the question becomes, from a society angle, who pays the rest of those damages? I think it should be, I think that's decisions for states to make. Who gets to pay that? Should it be an insurance policy paid by the user, paid by the producer? Or should it be some kind of public insurance policy like the ones we have with cars in most countries? There's always accidents that happen where the driver doesn't have a valid insurance, or where the driver can't be found. Then you have a tax on the sales of car throughout the country that finances an insurance fund that pays back those victims when they can't be paid back by an insurance because we can't find the insurer or it doesn't exist. So that's an option to compensate for those choices and for the actions of the machine. But that does not answer your questions on the actual accident optimization when someone that is not the user gets hit. Well, I guess it does in a sense, because then you would just say it's, the car hits someone on the street and decides to hit the old lady. And then you start that process, right? Was it the right conditions to use the car? Did they fail to retake control? Was the producer, was the failure foreseeable? Did they were they in good faith and in due diligence in making a safe design, or were they not? So I guess it does kind of answer your question, I hope.
Thank you so much for giving such a detailed answer. It was really nice to think about this.
But then, if you're getting a little bit tired, we can just ask a very light-hearted question. The one that is really I want to know, and you've kept us all in suspense, is why are engineers scared of artificial intelligence? This is mind-blowing to me.
Yeah. I mean, roboticists are, at least. I think it's because they don't have control over it. They're used to, I think engineers are really used to having absolute control over everything they design. And it's still foreign to them, the idea of making something that makes decision in turn. So it's kind of a loss of control over your creations. Maybe a bit of we could call that a Frankenstein paradox or something. You're afraid to lose control over your creation. Maybe there's a little bit of that. There's also the regulatory lack of clarity at the moment. Who is responsible if this happens, if the AI makes that decision, and so on and so forth. There's also the fact that AI is still a developmental technology. There's still a lot of work to be done about it. There's been a lot of hype. Some of that hype is blowing down. Some people are saying that we're entering the second AI winter now, which is kind of making me sad and making me wonder if I did the right, if I choose the right career track. So I think So one of the things I observed with the people I interviewed was that they make a very weird and slightly ridiculous difference between what they call decision AI and perception AI. So they would tell me, yes, we have AI in the product, but it does not make any decisions. And that's because, it's perception AI. It's visual recognition AI. It's AI that can see, that can identify human beings on a field. For example, there was this this agriculture robot that could plant stuff and remove pests from the ground. But it also had the ability to look at the ground and identify what it should remove, and also to look at around to see if there was any human beings. And they said, but it's just perception, it's not making any decision, right? But when it's deciding not to label something as a human being, they don't consider that's a decision, which is ludicrous, because the part of the system that labels data it perceives into specific elements, a car, a person, a plant, that to a large extent, that information goes unchecked to the decision-making part of the system, which is not AI. It's good old hand-coded software that does exactly what we tell it to. But it doesn't have any critical insight on what the perception AI parts of the machine feed it. So they're not saying, and they say, okay, fair enough. They have what they call redundant safety mechanisms. So layers and layers of different safety mechanisms that can retake control when part of it fails. So the perception AI fails to perceive a person on the field. It's fine. It will fail, but it will not create any damages because we have a bump sensor around the robot. If it hits anything, it stops moving. Which, okay, fair enough, but it's still not critically assessing what the perception AI is doing. So making a difference between perception and decision AI is a bit weird. So I don't know. It's hard to explain why they're afraid of it. They're definitely not completely certain and comfortable with it. But yeah, so regulation, Frankenstein syndrome. What else did we say? Well, yeah, that was my answer anyway.
Yeah, I think that was overall the two. Yeah, and how hand-coded software result is a good solution for the Frankenstein thing. Yeah, no, that's great. Does anyone have? I see Monica puts her mute and unmute. So is that a signal?
No, it's not.
Does anyone have any questions? We have 2 more minutes. Oh, Marika has now unmuted.
Oh. No. I just wanted to say, since we're soon ending the talk, I just wanted to put my microphone on to not miss and say thank you for Leonard, who took his time to be with us today and share to us his research, and as well as open our minds on what robot law is. And answer our questions. So yeah, I think very interesting topic, and I really loved listening to you, and I can't wait to see what you've researched. And I hope we were able to see that, the final results. So yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me here. It was a pleasure talking to you and answering your questions.
Yeah, thank you. It was really fun. Thank you so much.